Okay, so we already talked about early medieval and Romanesque period art. Today we're going to talk about Gothic period art and architecture, which is from the mid-12th century into the 15th century. Now during this time, Europe remained rural. Towns gained increasing prominence, and by the late 12th century, nearly all major cities that existed in Western Europe today were sizable urban centers. Towns and cities stimulated intellectual life. Urban universities replaced rural monastic schools as learning centers, and the first European university was founded in Bologna, Italy, and that was founded in the 11th century. The Gothic period saw a flowering of poetry, music, philosophy, and theology. As towns grew, they became more important centers of artistic patronage. The production and sale of goods were controlled by guilds. This included art. Guilds are organizations of people with related interests like merchants, artisans, bakers, painters, metalworks, and things like that. They organized to maintain standards and to protect the interests of its members. They formed these associations to advance their professional interests. So they're kind of like a union. Medieval guilds also played important social roles. They safeguarded members' political interests, organizing religious celebrations, and looking after members of their families in times of trouble. Much of the Gothic period was very prosperous. Many of these churches had to be rebuilt between the 1150 and 1400s, usually after fires. This period has been called the Age of Cathedrals. Cathedrals were very grand and very expensive. During the 12th century, there was a growth of intense religiosity among the regular people, and so this also fed into this cathedral building. Urban cathedrals functioned as seats of ruling bishops and were the centers of religious patronage throughout Western Europe during this period. By the middle of the 14th century, much of Europe was in crisis. Prosperity led to population growth, which by the 13th century had exceeded food production. During this time, famines increased, and also there were peasant revolts because of these worsening conditions, and this frustrated them and led to uprisings. And from about 1337 to 1453, we had the 100-Year War. This broke out between France and England, devastating much of France. And in the middle of the 14th century, we have the Black Death, which is the Black Plague. Killed about 40% of Europe. That number varies between whatever source you're reading, but about 40% of Europe's population. The church is also under great strain during this period. In 1309, the papal court was moved from Rome to southeastern France, and it remained there until 1377. 1378 to 1417 is known as the era of the Great Schism, or the Western Schism. This is when the papacy split with two contending popes. So they had one pope in France and the other pope in Rome, and both claimed to be pope. Of course, this caused a lot of problems. So that's the setting for this Gothic period. Now, let's first talk about Gothic architecture, because that's really what we'll be talking about mostly in this presentation. During the Romanesque period, we're looking at art and architecture, we really jumped around a lot. We were in France, and England, and Italy, but for the Gothic style, we're mostly going to be in France. France will really be the center of this Gothic style. While the Romanesque style was still being used in the mid-12th century, Gothic architecture emerged in France, near Paris. In France, the Gothic style developed under the growing power of the French monarchy, which means the kings. The Gothic style spread and was dominant in Western Europe art and architecture until about 1400. It lasted until about 1500 in many regions. The term Gothic was first introduced in the 16th century, so way after this period existed. So in the 16th century by the Italian artist / art historian Giorgio Vasari. And Vasari mistakenly attributed the style to the Goths. The Goths are the Germanic invaders who had destroyed, or who he had viewed as destroying the classic civilization of the Roman Empire that he admired so much. So this term Goth or Gothic has a negative connotation. He saw the Gothic style as being very ugly and barbaric. But during its time, when the Gothic style was thriving, it was called the modern style or the French style. And as it spread from France, it gradually replaced the Romanesque forms. Now it does take on regional characteristics, and it is inspired by Romanesque forms. Now I've written up here on this presentation a few key elements to help you identify the Gothic style. It's a little bit of a cheat sheet. It's not always true, but it does kind of help when you're trying to identify it. During the Gothic period, they wanted their buildings to be taller than other churches in the region. This has to do with civic pride. They want their tallest buildings to tower over the landscape and really intimidate other towns. Now remember, during this is the time before skyscrapers and things like that. So really these big churches are the biggest thing in the area. They also wanted dissolving of architecture. This means that they wanted their walls to become thinner and opened up to more windows. They also wanted it to be brighter to allow light to come in. And this is really the main point of Gothic architecture. The main goal of Gothic architecture is light. They wanted as much light as possible to come into the sanctuary. And the reason is they believed that this light, there was this philosophy at this time that light was sacred. It was sort of like the Holy Spirit coming into the building. One of the easy markers to identify Gothic compared to Romanesque is we have pointed arches. And you can see that on this example here. We have these pointed arches instead of the rounded Romanesque arches. They also use rib vaults, stained glass, flying buttresses, and that three-part elevation that we began to see in really Charlemagne's period, but also in the Romanesque period of the nave, the triforium, and the clerestory will continue to be used, but really more defined. You can see looking here on the exterior or the facade of this church, it really looks like you do have three kind of stories. One here, and then this top one here. I mentioned that flying buttresses were one of the features or characteristics of the Gothic cathedral. Now, sometimes flying buttresses are used sort of retroactively on other churches, like on Romanesque churches. But here you can see an example of flying buttresses. Flying buttresses are used to transmit the horizontal force of a vaulted ceiling through the walls and across an intervening space, which might be used for an aisle, a chapel, or a cloister, to a counterweight outside the building. As a result, the buttress seemingly flies through the air and hence is known as a flying buttress. Working with the pointed arch, the flying buttress is able to transfer weight from the wall to the exterior. So the flying buttress serves this function, but they also start to become very ornate and very beautiful. And you can kind of see that here in this image right here. Again, that pointed arch that I mentioned, the pointed arch is also a big breakthrough during this period and really contrasts to the Romanesque period. It's working with buttressing to pull the weight outwards, and it takes its form from the Roman curved arch, but modifies it. The explosion of cathedral building during the Middle Ages, during this time it is estimated that several millions of tons of stone were quarried to build some 80 cathedrals, 500 large churches, tens of thousands of parish churches. And within 100 years, some 2,700 churches were built in the region around Paris alone. This explosion of cathedral building began with the construction of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis on the outskirts of Paris. It was originally a Benedictine monastery of Saint Denis. It's a few miles north of Paris, and it became symbolic to the French monarchy. The reason is it actually houses the tombs of the French kings, and it also houses the regalia of the French crown and the relics of Saint Denis, who is the patron saint of France. And he's also the legendary first bishop of Paris. In the 1130s, construction began on a new abbey church, known as Europe's first Gothic structure. So star that in your notes. The Abbey Church of Saint Denis is known as Europe's first Gothic structure. The director of this project, we don't know the actual designers, but the director of the project was Abbot Sugar. He was a well-traveled man, and he had seen the latest developments in church buildings. So he got to see a lot of Romanesque buildings. His design combined elements from many sources. He used masons and sculptors from other regions because the Paris region had very few monumental Romanesque buildings. And he needed to import people with the knowledge of these Romanesque building styles so that he could kind of create this new Gothic style. Saint Denis became a center of artistic interchange because he's bringing in all these people from different locations. But unfortunately, Sugar did not record the names of the masters that he employed, so we don't know who actually was coming up with these specific designs. Now, this is a really big building project, as are all cathedrals that we're going to look at. So where do they get their funding? Well, they receive large annual payments from the townspeople. They used fundings from the royalty, so the royal coffers. They also got money from fellow clerics. Now, originally, looking at two pictures here, the one with one tower is how it looks today. With two towers is how it was originally designed and how it was originally built. But the north tower had to be removed after it was struck by lightning in the 19th century. So you can just see by that artist's recreation that it was intended to have two towers. Sugar's masons combined the Norman facade design like we saw here at Saint Denis. We're looking at in the last presentation. Combines that with the richly sculptural portals like those of Aton. The narrative sculpture spreads all over 3 portals instead of just kind of limited to one like it was in the Romanesque. So it combines this kind of plain, two-towered exterior with this ornate portal, kind of characteristic more of France. The choir at the end of the church represented an important change from the Romanesque style. The plan of the choir looked like that of a Romanesque pilgrimage church with a semicircular sanctuary surrounded by an ambulatory from which radiated 7 chapels and was lit by large stained glass windows. It combined Romanesque features to create a fully integrated architectural whole that emphasized the open flowing space. Chapels, sanctuaries, and ambulatories were opened up to one another, so again, really creating some movement. The walls of the stained glass replaced masonry, so this permitted more light to come into the interior, and also light reflecting the stained glass color. To accomplish this effect, the masons used advanced vaulting techniques. Sugar saw that light and color he really saw this as a way of illuminating the soul and uniting it with God. So light becomes very symbolic. Stained glass windows and golden church furnishings transformed the material world into the splendor of paradise. So just like we've been talking about with all the other churches, we have this sort of transformation to the heavenly realm when you enter the church. But of course, these churches will be much more ornate on the exterior as well. So the church was finally completed a century later. Sugar's progress was stopped by the Second Crusade and lack of royal funds. It is highly restored today. It was severely damaged by the French Revolution in the late 18th century. It was restored in the 19th and 20th century. but it became a prototype